My grandmother was 4 feet 11 inches tall, 95 pounds, only if she was wearing a hat. She was a little bitty thing, but hardly weak and fragile. She read voraciously. She loved to have scholarly conversations, and there was practically no subject that she could not have something to say. One of her favorite areas of conversation was theology, biblical history, theology, philosophy. And I remember one time she asked me to come in to the living room where she was, and let's talk about Genesis. Okay, that's the first book in both the Hebrew and Christian scriptures, and it's the story of creation, or at least the beginning of Genesis is the story of creation. And my grandmother said, this is mythology. And I said, well, okay. And she said, no, listen, Greg, it's mythology. Mythology does not mean untrue, just the opposite. It's something that's so true, so important, so significant. The only way we can really appreciate it is to talk about it in terms of a story or poetry. So let's do that. And she talked about literature and styles of literature and poetry and that kind of thing. And we went through the book of Genesis. And we noted that there were water animals before there were feathered animals, before there were furry animals and that sort of thing. And my grandmother was perfectly comfortable bringing in science, botany, biology, zoology, anthropology, all of that, as a way of underscoring the validity of the biblical record. That we know, for example, there were fish and reptiles before there were birds and mammals. That didn't bother her at all. In fact, she welcomed science and science's input in the discussion of the creation of the universe. She would say, this tells us how things happened, Greg, but it doesn't answer the question why. So she said, why do you think God made all this stuff? I said, well, I'm not really sure. Why do you think? And she said, well, I don't know for sure, but I think it's because God was lonely. I think God wanted to be in relationship with something that was created. So let's look at that. We went back and we looked at each day. At the end of each day, God said, looking back on this creation, oh, this is good. And at the end of the week in the biblical story, people made the scene and God said, it was very good. She said, so what does that tell you about the nature of creation and especially about the nature of human beings? I thought about that and I said, well, all of creation is good based on this story, and people are very good. And she said, excellent. So nothing in the created world is bad or evil, and people are very good. Interesting, I thought. Well, that says a lot about her orientation toward the world and toward people. She was always looking for ways to help other people, and she was always very gracious, very forgiving toward other people. And she was quite a conservationist. She was really worried. This was back many, many years ago, 50 years ago, more than 50 years ago. She was really concerned about what we might be doing to our environment, and it disturbed her. Even then, she might be called an environmentalist, because all of this created order is good and is to be enjoyed by us, but taken care of by us. We were to be stewards of it. In other words, we were the ones who were going to be ultimately held accountable. We were going to be responsible for all of this. Well, these conversations would take place regularly between my grandmother and me. We'd have conversations about theology and scripture and philosophy and religion in general. We'd have conversations about theater and politics, all kinds of things. And in my radical days as a rebellious teenager, as often the case, I shared with her some of my literature, some of what might be called radical literature, and she would read it, and she was okay with it. Even though some of the language offended her, she would talk about it. Just like I would talk about any book that I took out of her library. She had thousands of books, literally thousands of books, not only in a room that was a library, floor to ceiling, but everywhere you turned, she had books, bookshelves, bookcases. Even in the attic, there were bookcases along the walls, all around the attic, literally thousands of books. We gave many thousands of books to the library after she died. And anyone was fair game. We just had to talk to her about it. And nothing was off limits. I thought that was cool at the time. I look back on it now and I realize how special that really is. And I would call her a hero because she instilled in me this wonderful love of books and this incredible curiosity of what's going on in the world around me. Who is God and what is God up to in my life? And a faith in that God, that presence is always here, always with me. And that any subject is open to investigation and conversation and needs to be engaged. So she helped my academic career, my academic pursuit of reading and knowledge and discovery, and I'm just so grateful to her. And if you saw her on the street, she's long dead now, may she rest in peace. But if you saw her on the street, you would say, well, she's kind of an unremarkable person, born in the late 1800s and a little bitty thing, very formal, very petite, always properly dressed and so on, used very proper English and all of that, and very much like her compatriots. But here was this woman who cared very deeply about this teenage boy, so much that she engaged him in some very critical conversations, which changed my life, set my life moving in a very healthy direction. So I'm grateful to her, and I think of her as my hero, even though she would not wear a cape, probably far from it. But I would say to her now, with all these conversations that we've had through the years, Graham, I'm so grateful, and you've got this. Atta girl.